Quick note before we kick things off. This is the last session in the .NET track. Immediately after this session is where they will be giving away prizes, and that'll take place in the same room where the keynote was that kicked off the event. So you'd also, I'm being told you need to be present to win any of the prizes. So definitely make sure to attend that. So with a show of hands, who attended my talk on day one, my ASP.NET Core talk? So fair amount of the room. This talk is not as much of a deep dive as that. This is more of a broad look at what has changed in ASP.NET Core 2.0, and it has a strong emphasis on some of the optimizations that have been introduced with the 2.0 release. For those that didn't attend, my name's Scott ADDIE, and I am a member of the docs team at Microsoft. Specifically, it's the docs.microsoft.com platform that Microsoft has been investing heavily in. My specific responsibility there is I'm aligned with the ASP.NET Core team, documenting things like what I'm going to talk about today. So let's start off with agenda, so you know what to expect out of this talk. What I first want to focus on is actually one of the biggest areas of change in 2.0, which is publish size reduction. The size of the bundle that you need to deploy to your server in 2.0. That's really what that's getting at. From there, we're going to take a look at view compilation changes. And specifically, this is Razor views we're talking about here. And from there, we'll dive into a new feature in the .NET Core 2.0 SDK called the Metapackage. You'll learn what that really means in a bit. From there, we'll look at something that's closely related to the Metapackage called the .NET Runtime Store. And then we'll look at some of the simplifications that have been made in the configuration system when compared to the 1.x release. I think you'll be surprised at how simple things have become as of 2.0 in that particular area. And we'll wrap things up here looking at project templates and a new feature in 2.0 called Razor Pages. Did anyone attend Ed Charbonneau's ASP.NET Core Angular talk earlier this afternoon? Okay, so you would have seen some of the project template stuff. I'll try not to spend too much time on what he focused on in that talk. So let's dive right in. Now, when we look at publish size reduction, why is this even worth talking about? Well, it's worth talking about because the change here is significant. I like to compare the 1.x release as the donut and the 2.0 is the healthy apple. If we look at the difference in terms of published bundle size, if I were to go to File, New Project in Visual Studio 2017 and choose the web application template, this is that MVC starter application, and then immediately publish that application without making any changes, it's 16.8 megs worth of files that I would need to deploy to my web server. Now, as soon as I change the authentication in that project template from none to use the identity framework, I'm then looking at 26.7 megs worth of files that need to be deployed to my web server. And next to this on the slide, you're seeing the significant difference as of 2.0, the optimization that has occurred here. Take that same application, that MVC application created by going to File, New Project, and we get just 2.6 megs worth of files that we have to deploy to our web server. Add on identity, and of course the number increases, but not by much. Just over 3 megs worth of files that we're deploying to our server. How is this even possible? Well, there's really two things that are responsible for the big difference we're seeing here, and we're about to talk about those in a bit. But as a caveat, what I like to say here is most people aren't aware that with ASP.NET Core, there are two different methodologies, two different ways that you can publish your application. And those are a framework-dependent deployment, or what's commonly referred to as FDD. And there's also the self-contained deployment, or SCD. SCD is the flashy one that you typically see at conferences where the speaker will deploy the ASP.NET Core application to a USB flash drive, plug it into a machine in the audience, and the application just runs on that flash drive. That is not the default deployment methodology when you go to file new project. It's actually using the first one I mentioned, which is framework-dependent deployment. And so these numbers that you're seeing here are assuming framework-dependent deployment. And the reason why I call that out is if you are doing a self-contained deployment, these numbers are going to increase a little bit. So the first factor that is responsible for this reduction in publish size is really that Razor View compilation. In a 1.x application, we would have had to opt into this feature. It was not on by default. And quite honestly, there were a lot of developers out there who were not even aware of this. What it comes down to is if you enable Razor View compilation, your CS/HTML files will no longer appear in the published output. They will be compiled up into the binary. And what that does is it improves startup performance of your application and reduces the size. And so let's look at a quick example here. Take that same example of creating a brand new ASP.NET Core 2.0 MVC application. And you're going to notice up here on the screen this MVC Razor compile on publish property in the CS proj file. In this case, I have specifically opted out of it by setting it to false. The effect that this has at publish time is what you're seeing here in Solution Explorer. I am now going to see a views folder in the publish bundle. Now, if I just stick with the default that I get, File, New Project, in Visual Studio, it's on by default, and so your CS proj would look like this. You notice it's just that one property that's toggling this behavior. How does Solution Explorer look after I publish it now? Well, you're going to notice that the views folder that was there is now gone. The CS/HTML files have been compiled up into that binary, and you can deploy that to your server, and you're going to notice a significant difference in size, as we saw on the previous slide. So that's just one change. The other feature that is contributing to that reduction in publish size actually has a much bigger impact, and that's this new thing that I was calling the Metapackage. You can think of the Metapackage as a kitchen sink of NuGet packages. It's the mega package. It's just a giant NuGet package that contains a list of all of the NuGet packages that you would need to use ASP.NET Core 2.0 or Entity Framework 2.0, as well as the third-party dependencies that are needed for those two. And so let's look here. What this equates to is in your CS proj file, for the most part, that giant list of Microsoft-authored NuGet packages that you had in your 1.x application can be reduced down to this single package reference that you're seeing here. So the name of this meta package is microsoft.aspnetcore.all. And take a look at the version here, 2.0.0. So this is another significant thing I want to point out here. That version number of the meta package will now align with the version of ASP.NET Core. So as ASP.NET Core revs, and let's say version 2.1 is released, the version of this NuGet package will match that. So there's no longer this confusion that we had in the 1.x world where, you know, I think I need this NuGet package. I'm not sure what version. Let's just try out a couple of versions and see if this works. That was one of the biggest complaints that the product team heard with the 1.x release, and this is their attempt to simplify that. One other caveat to this meta package that we're talking about here is only something you can use if you're targeting .NET Core 2.0. .NET Core, actually. If you're targeting .NET Framework, this cannot be used. With that being said, if you are targeting .NET Framework, what does that mean for you? Well, it means you need to continue to list out the individual package references just as you did in your 1.x application. Keep that in mind. Now, in Solution Explorer, taking a look at that, you know, what does this really look like? Just to show you, there's really no magic here. This meta package at the top level, just as I said, contains anything that you would possibly need to use ASP.NET Core 2.0 or Entity Framework 2.0. And so you might notice in there's all kinds of authentication NuGet packages supporting our identity framework. We've got ASP.NET Core itself. And this is by no means an exhaustive list of what's included in that meta package. You could scroll for days here. But this is an optimization the team has made both to make you more productive as a developer and to really reduce that publish size. And what it means is when you go to publish now, all of those NuGet packages will no longer be published as binaries in your published bundle. It's assuming, again, that you're doing a framework-dependent deployment in this scenario, which means .NET Core 2.0 is installed on your machine you're deploying to that the application is running on. So it's going to look at a specific location on that server or on your development machine for these binaries. And the advantage here is not only the reduction in publish size, but performance. Any binaries that are located here, which we'll actually talk more about it on the next slide, is called the runtime store. Any binaries located in this runtime store are already warmed up and pre-JITted. Therefore, performance will drastically improve in comparison to 1.x. And so we alluded to this thing called the runtime store. As soon as you use this meta package, that has opted you into the underlying component that supports it, called the .NET Core Runtime Store. And this is actually installed with the .NET Core SDK, the 2.0 version. So when you go to install the .NET Core 2.0 SDK, in the installer, you'll actually see it call out that it has installed this mysterious thing called the Runtime Store. You'll also hear it referred to as the Runtime Package Store. Same thing. All right. So at this point, you know, we've said with the application we've been talking about thus far, if I go to publish this application, those supporting binaries for ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework Core, would not be included in the bin folder, in the published output. The next question you might be wondering or wanting to ask is, well, how do I achieve the same thing with third-party dependencies that I'm constantly pulling into my applications? Say that you know at your particular organization, you always reference version 9.0.1 of Newtonsoft.json, or you always reference a specific version number of mock, MOQ. Well, there's actually a way to do this for your own third-party dependencies that you rely on quite heavily. And so what I want to do here is a quick demo of how you might achieve that. And so what I've done is I have built a ASP.NET Core 2.0 application. Duplicate. And it is targeting .NET Core 2.0. So that's what you're seeing here in Solution Explorer. And just to show you that this has a couple of third-party dependencies, this is kind of showing off a new feature in Visual Studio as well. Notice here I can just right-click the project, and I have this new Edit CS Proj option. This isn't new as of 2.0, but it's something you'll get with the core stack. It's based on a new CPS-based project system. That's what unlocks this option. Compare that to the ASP.NET 4.x days where you had to right-click, unload, right-click, edit. This eases some of that pain. So you'll notice here we've got a total of 3 package references in our CS Proj. We've got the Metapackage that we discussed early on. We've also got JSON.NET and mock. And you're seeing what I'm talking about here on lines 7 through 9. And there's specific version numbers that we're targeting there. If I were to publish this application as is, just right-click the project, go to publish, do it the easy way. What I would see in the published output is the binaries that are necessary for Newtonsoft.json and mock. That's the problem we want to fix. We want to deploy the application without seeing those in the bin folder. We do not want to deploy those to our web server. So how do we do this? Well, I'm going to hop over to VS Code. And so there's a couple of steps to this. The first step is you create a CS Proj file. Name it whatever you want. In this case, I've called it packages.csproj. And it's in that CS Proj. I'll show you the contents here. It's in that CS Proj that you're going to list out these. I ran the wrong command. You're going to list out the NuGet packages. And in this case, that was Newtonsoft.json and mock. And you're going to list out the specific versions. And it's going to look very much like what you saw in the CS proj for the ASP.NET Core application. Let me run this. By the way, this if you're interested in how I did this, I'm actually using an Azure CLI extension in Visual Studio that allows me to just put my cursor next to the command I want to run, right-click, and choose Run. I'll show you what that is here. So it finished running. I think it froze up. So let me open this file I was going to show you in a slightly different way. So again, this packages CS proj file is nothing more than listing the package references that we want to not publish to our bundle. Newtonsoft, JSON, mock, and the specific version numbers. Let's close. Let me try relaunching VS Code. All right, open file. It's already open, I'm good. Let's try this again. Right click, and again, this is this Azure CLI extension that's giving me this run line and terminal option. There we go. Here's the contents of the file I showed you, just to show you there's no cheating going on here. I'm going to clear the screen. I accidentally ran this command, so I don't need to do that anymore, but what was that command doing? Well, that was invoking the underlying .NET Core CLI, and specifically it was calling the store command on the CLI. And it's this manifest flag that's pointing to the CS proj file that we just discussed. The other two things that this is doing is it's using a runtime flag to tell it, hey, the runtime that I'm using here is the 64-bit version of Windows 10. I want to create a custom runtime store specifically tailored to the 64-bit version of Windows 10. And I want this to work for any ASP.NET Core 2.0 application that's targeting the framework referenced here, .NET Core 2.0. This is just the target framework moniker for .NET Core 2.0, or the TFM, as you might hear it called. Now let me just switch directories here to where my application lives that I have open in Visual Studio. And I've got one more command here that I need to run. And this is the, again, using the underlying .NET Core CLI. And this time, instead of calling the store command, I want to actually publish the application. So I'm just going to call publish. This is actually what Visual Studio is calling under the hood. When I go to right-click publish, it's just shelling out to the .NET Core CLI. And specifically what this command is doing is it's pointed at a file that was generated called artifact.xml. That file was generated when .NET Store successfully executed. And there's really nothing interesting about that file to show, but it is there already because I've successfully run .NET Store. And the final switch that I'm passing here is -C, and I'm telling the .NET Core CLI to publish this application in release mode as opposed to debug mode. And so now what I want to do is run this, and when this completes the publish, I'm going to go over to Visual Studio and show you what that published output looks like. And what we should see in Visual Studio is that the Newtonsoft JSON and mock binaries are no longer there. The other thing we would see at this point, even before I ran the publish, is that a new folder was created on my machine. So under your user profile, /.net/store/x64 in this case, it's that .NET Store command that created this folder matching the target framework that I had specified, .NET Core App 2.0. So let me switch into that folder. What do we see here? And again, this was all produced by the .NET Store command that we ran. We're actually seeing 3 folders here. Why 3? Well, we can probably guess why Newtonsoft.json and mock are there. but there's this mysterious castle.core folder that lives there as well. Castle is actually another NuGet package that mock takes as a dependency. And so what's happened here is .NET Store has actually flattened out that dependency hierarchy and created a folder structure to represent it here. And this is where that generated artifact XML file was dropped as well. All right, see if the publish completed. Looks like it did. So now if I go back to Visual Studio, I can show all files, go to my bin folder and then release, because remember I published this under the release configuration. You'll notice nowhere in here now do you see the binaries for those third-party dependencies. So that's really going to reduce the footprint or the size of the bundle that we need to publish to our web server. It's just another optimization that you can make. While I'm here, I commonly get asked this question. For the sake of demos, I commonly like to denote to the right of the project name what I'm using here for a tech stack, ASP.NET Core 2.0, targeting .NET Core 2.0. And the reason why I do this is people easily get confused with ASP.NET Core because you can target either .NET Framework or .NET Core, and there are some subtle differences. But you know, if you're interested in applying something like that at work, it's as simple as adding this project UI subcaption node and just putting the text inside. Kind of an aside, but commonly get that question. All right, let's jump back into the slides. All right, so we looked at how to create a custom runtime store. Now let's look at some of the optimizations that were made in 2.0. But in order to appreciate those optimizations, we have to take a look at where we came from. So with a lot of the 1.x ASP.NET Core applications that are out there in the wild, you would have a program.cs file. In that program.cs file, you would have a main method that contains a whole bunch of boilerplate code just like this. And in fact, this is what you would see if you went to File, New Project, and created a new 1.x application. What the team realized was, you know what? We have a whole bunch of customers telling us, and we've seen it ourselves now, that none of this code really changes across those 1.x applications. It all remains pretty much the same. Let's take a further look then at the supporting piece here in 1.x, which is your startup CS file. And for those that aren't familiar with startup CS, this is what has replaced the global ASAX file from the ASP.NET 4X days. It's kind of the bootstrap file. The same thing was true here. Not a whole lot of this code changes across 1.x applications. It remains pretty much the same. And specifically, let's take a look at the lines up here that call add JSON file. It's the app settings JSON file that we're configuring here. We're telling ASP.NET Core to make itself aware of this so we can retrieve configuration values for our application. And you know, if you think about it, there aren't a whole lot of applications out there that don't have a need to store and retrieve configuration values. So why make the developer add that code over and over again? If we take a look a little further down, ASP.NET Core has this notion of environment variables, where you're able to set an environment variable with a reserved name. I believe it's ASP.NET Core _ environment. You can set that to values like development or production or staging to trigger certain behaviors in your application. And you see the line here that says builder.add environment variables. Well, you know, again, why should we have to include that code in all of our ASP.NET Core applications? That's a really useful feature that we're probably going to use in every app we create. So you get the point. There was this common theme that we're making developers include boilerplate code that really never changes across apps. This is something the team set out to address in 2.0. And so how did that change? Well, program.cs was reduced down to what you see here. Really what's changed is they've introduced this build WebHost method that is invoked from the main method. And you take a look here, it's really just use startup and build that we are calling in this build WebHost method. Now if I go back a couple of slides, just to refresh your memory, compare that to this. It's a little cleaner now in 2.0. There's much less to be concerned with. And again, here was the 1.x startup CS. So here is what startup CS looks like in a 2.0 application. Again, much cleaner. And I commonly joke with people that in my experience in upgrading from 1.x to 2.0, my most used key on the keyboard is actually delete. And you're seeing here, yeah, that's probably true. Specifically, what's missing here from a 1.x application is in our program.cs file, we no longer have to invoke use IIS integration. We no longer have to invoke use Kestrel. We no longer have to invoke things like use content root. By the way, is everyone familiar with Kestrel and what this is by a show of hands? Okay, so I'll quickly discuss what Kestrel is. Kestrel is this lightweight web server. It's been there from the very beginning, 1.x. And the way that you would use Kestrel is you would couple it with a proxy server, something like IIS if you're using Windows, or maybe Nginx or Apache if you're on Linux. And you set up this reverse proxy so that IIS, for example, is sitting out in front listening for requests coming in on ports 443 and 80. It's then going to forward those requests over to what I like to call its little brother, Kestrel, or little sister. And Kestrel then services that request and handles the rest of the work from there. And the reason why you need this reverse proxy is at this time, Kestrel is not really suited to serve as a public-facing edge server. And that's something the team's working on. But as of right now, the typical use case is you're going to have a reverse proxy scenario where, again, on Windows, it would be IIS and Kestrel. Or if it's some other OS, you would typically use Nginx and Kestrel. You can use Kestrel as a public-facing edge server. However, it's not recommended, and there are some limitations. So just take that to mean don't do it. One other thing to call out here that has changed in 2.0 is over in program.cs, in that particular file in a 1.x application, we would have had to invoke a method called use application insights if we were using Microsoft's application performance monitoring tool, App Insights. Well, the good news here is if you're using Visual Studio 2017, the latest release, I believe 15.3 and above actually, it includes new light up tooling, which means you no longer have to add any code to your ASP.NET Core application to opt into Application Insights. In other words, if I were to go to File, New Project in Visual Studio, create a new ASP.NET Core 2.0 app targeting .NET Core, and just hit the play button, run, you would notice that locally App Insights just works. And if you sift through the code in the application, you won't find any Application Insights specific code in there. So that's yet another way that the team is reducing that footprint. All right. So I wanted to do a demo here for adding configuration providers. And the reason why I want to do this is just to prove to you that Microsoft is really lessening the burden here. And to prove to you that they've done that, what I've got here is I've gone out to GitHub, one of the ASP.NET repositories out there. Specifically, this is the GitHub repository for the Metapackage we talked about. And you'll notice there's this create default builder method here. This is where everything, or I shouldn't say everything, but a lot of that stuff we had to actually include in our 1.x applications, this is where all of that has moved. And so you'll notice here on lines 160, 161, that's where ASP.NET Core is now wiring up app settings.json and any environment-specific app settings files, meaning us as developers no longer have to worry about doing that. Further down in here, you're going to notice it's down on line 173 there. It's wiring up the environment variables, and that was one of the calls that I specifically called out in the demo. It's also adding user secrets. For those that aren't familiar with user secrets, I like to describe this as the development grade version of what Microsoft offers in Azure, which is Azure Key Vault, for securely storing things like usernames, passwords, database connection strings, anything that's sensitive. This is a development grade version of Azure Key Vault that you would use with ASP.NET Core. So it wires that up as well if we're running in development mode. Point here is it's doing a whole lot of work for you that you would have had to do yourself in 1.x applications. Configuring logging, calling use IIS integration. It's a bunch of ugly code that personally I would prefer just to not write. What this means then, sticking with this same sample application, what this means to you as a developer is what I'm about to show. Let's say, for example, your team has some naming convention for their config files. Say you're in a meeting and your team lead says, appsettings.json, huh? That's a pretty terrible name. Why don't we name that to something else? Maybe something a little more terrible like myconfig.json. You know, bad example here, but the point being your team typically has naming standards, and that's fine. What I've done here is I've renamed this to myconfig.json. What that means then is because this code is running in the background, and I've renamed that file from appsettings.json to myconfig.json, ASP.NET Core 2.0 is no longer aware of that configuration file, and I have to manually wire it up. How do you do that? It's actually not too bad. So there's a couple of steps. If I go to my program.cs file, it's immediately after I call use startup, which by the way is just pointing to that startup CS file. It's immediately here that I would invoke another method called configure app configuration. I'll just paste it in from Notepad here. All right, and then I'll explain what I've pasted in. Format that. All right, and then we'll save. All right, so what I've done on line 17 here is I'm actually clearing out or reversing a lot of that work that ASP.NET Core has done for me in the background. And this is that code I was showing you on GitHub. I'm clearing out the sources and providers that were added for me by default, which means if I were to look at that sources collection in debug mode, I'm no longer going to see that it's wired up appsettings.json in any environment-specific app settings files. I've told it to clear those out, which means when I go down to line 18 and that executes, I'm starting with a clean plate here. Config.sources will be an empty collection. And I'm going to add to it a reference to my renamed config file, myconfig.json. One other thing is when I renamed that, notice in Solution Explorer, it also applied that same rename to the associated environment-specific config files. So myconfig.development.json. Now, how do I prove that this is actually working? Well, there's a couple more steps involved here. Let's say, for example, I want to go into the myconfig.json file, and I want to add a message property here. All right, so I'll do that. You'll notice how easy this configuration system is to use. It's all JSON-based. Say, hello, DevReach. All right. Now I want to actually retrieve that with the configuration system and make sure I didn't break anything when I cleared out the sources in program CS. So let me go, let's say, to my index view. And I just want to retrieve the value of the message property that I added and retrieve it. And again, I'm just going to go to Notepad here, paste in some code, and then explain what's going on. All right. So lines 5 through 8 there are what I just pasted in. And specifically what's going on there is I'm importing a configuration namespace. And the reason why I'm doing that is I want to do dependency injection into this Razor view. And that's actually what's going on in the next line below, line 6. I'm referencing the inject directive, which does that dependency injection. And I'm injecting an instance of iConfiguration, and I'm naming that instance configuration so that I can use it downstream in the view. And it's on line 8 where I actually use that to hopefully pull out the value of the message property. let me run this to make sure that's working. And when this comes up on that main page, it should hopefully display hello DevReach if this is working properly. And by the way, the reason why I'm able to use things like that inject directive, and I talked a bit about this yesterday, is because ASP.NET Core ships with its own native IOC container. In ASP.NET 4X, to do something similar, you would have had to add a NuGet package to something like Ninject or AutoFac or Unity. So sure enough, there's the value. It was pulled out of the config file. How cool is that? There was a clap over here. That was a golf clap, though. Yeah, okay. So my point being there, we didn't break anything, and with very little code, we were able to reach into that config file that we had renamed and pull out the value. It's pretty impressive, I think. All right. Let's go back into the slides. Let's see. Okay. So I don't have slides for the next two things that I'm going to talk about because it actually involves going into Visual Studio. So let me do that. And we're going to talk about project templates right now. So if I stop debugging, let's go to File, New Project. And again, I'm using the latest version of the latest stable release of Visual Studio 2017 up here. If I go to File, New Project, Ed showed this off a little earlier. Let's choose ASP.NET Core Web Application and just discuss some of the changes that have occurred since the earlier releases of ASP.NET Core. The one that commonly confuses people is, okay, we've got Web Application now and we've got Web Application Model View Controller. What's going on there? Well, Web Application, the template named just Web Application, was actually an MVC template in previous releases. It is now using something called Razor Pages, which is why the other template is there. Web Application Model View Controller is what we had before that was named Web Application. Why the change? Well, what the team noticed as they went out to places like universities and talked to students, or even went out and reached out to external development communities who were interested in learning ASP.NET, they noticed, you know what, we might need to lower the barrier to entry here in ASP.NET. There are a lot of moving parts in the MVC paradigm. All of a sudden, you've got to concern yourself with this notion of models, views, and controllers, and various other moving parts. There's a lot of files there. Okay, I don't know what's going on there. Let me just quickly scaffold one of these projects here using Razor Pages and explain to you what you're seeing. So Razor Pages, a lot of people would call it an application model in the sense that Web Forms is an application model, MVC is an application model, so is Web API and SignalR. However, it's not really a new application model. And the reason why it's not is it's just something that is built on top of MVC. And what that means then is any feature you have in MVC can be used in a Razor Pages application. Things like action filters, exception filters, routing, all of that same goodness is baked into Razor Pages and is fully usable. So there's some simplification here compared to MVC. And you're going to notice specifically in Solution Explorer, I've got a Pages folder and no other folders at all. Already, if I'm brand new to ASP.NET, I'm quite pleased with what I see here. There's not this cognitive strain I had when looking at what was scaffolded for an MVC application. Expand that, and you're going to see some stark similarities here to what you'd get with MVC. We've got our master layout file, which in MVC would be located under the Views Shared folder. Nothing has really changed in that file. You've got your View Imports file. You've got your View Start file. And you've got all of the same default CSHTML files that you would have in an MVC application. But there's a subtle difference here. Let me close these open tabs. Razor Pages says, okay, we've consolidated things here. We've got a Razor view. We need to, since we don't have controllers, we need to give the developer a place to put that logic that they would have written in C#. And because we don't have a models folder, we need to give the developers a place to put the models and the properties. And so what they've done is they've introduced what you might think is a code behind, but it's actually called a page model. So if anyone has come from web forms development, it's not going to be such a foreign concept, but again, it's called a page model. And the page model is this index.cshtml.cs file. The naming convention is we'll take the file name for the Razor view and append .cs to that. And this is our opportunity to include any of that controller and model logic that we would have had in MVC. And so what you start off with is something like this. By the way, the difference between an MVC Razor view and a Razor Pages Razor view is line 1. It's that page directive. The presence of that page directive is what makes this a Razor Pages view and not an MVC view. And also, by the way, you can easily mix MVC and Razor Pages together in the same application. Keep that in mind. So let's take a look at that associated page model. One way I can do that is just open the file as I did, or I could right-click the name of the model after this model directive, go to definition. It'll take me right there. What are we looking at here? Well, what we get out of the box is this onGet method. OnGet, you can think of this sort of like action methods in web API controllers. OnGet is going to respond to an HTTP GET request. So if I run this application, it's that index view that will display, and it's actually going to execute this onGet method because that initial request is a GET. And nothing spectacular is going to happen here because I've told the method to do nothing at all. That's what I was given when I scaffolded the project. Let's run the application first so you can see what we have. And when it comes up, you're going to notice it really looks no different than the default project template for MVC. And that's intentional. All right. So once this comes up, I'll just prove to you that it is a fully functioning application. Looks just like the MVC application that you would get out of the box. All right. Now let's do something to see how this onGet method works. Go back into Visual Studio. All right. So we said, okay, there's no models folder here. One way that we can represent the model is by adding it actually inside of this page model class. We can add properties here. So let's add a property of type string. We'll call it message. Just leave it like that. And let's say in my onGet method, I want to set that property to something. Say message. We'll stick with the same boring example. Hello, DevReach. All right. That's great. How do I display that now? It's actually pretty easy. So we've got a model property. Think of this as your model in MVC. Line 2 has already done the work of binding that page model to this Razor Pages view, which means down here, I can do something very similar as I did in my configuration example. I can say @model dot, and IntelliSense is going to tell me, sure enough, there's a message property on that associated model. Save the file. We'll run. And it should display hello DevReach. Now for larger applications, obviously something like that might not scale to represent all of those properties inside of the page model. And so what I commonly see people do then is just recreating the models folder and creating their DTO classes inside of there and then referencing those. And that's perfectly acceptable as well. But again, Razor Pages is really great at lowering that barrier to entry, increasing your productivity, and you are given the opportunity to reintroduce that complexity if the need arises. All right. Close that. Now, one more tidbit on Razor Pages. We already talked about this page directive, and again, this is a Razor Pages specific directive that we're seeing on line 1. It's this directive that gives you the opportunity to customize what the route is to navigate to that specific view. So out of the box, routing is based on the location of the view on disk. And so what that means is if I were to fire up this application as I did earlier on localhost, I could just append to that URL /home or nothing at all in the case of index, and it would navigate to the index view. If I wanted to navigate to the about view, I could append to the localhost URL /about, and it would navigate there. So the routing is already set up. But let's say maybe we have a use case for index view model where we want the user to pass an ID to get there. And we might have some kind of constraint on that routing parameter. In this case, maybe we expect the user to pass in some sort of ID. And by the way, that ID should be an integer. So we'll define a constraint by using :int on that routing parameter. So now if I fire up the application and try to navigate to that page, it's not going to pull up the page because that route no longer matches. I would have to modify the URL manually in the browser address bar and add something like 123 at the end, /123. Let's go back into our onGet method and let's modify what's going on here. Just to show you that, indeed this really is built on top of MVC and you have access to those same MVC features that you've used probably for years. Again, I'm going to lean on trusty Notepad here. And I'm going to modify my property setter here. So what did I just paste in? Well, I am going to reach into the route data collection and pull out the ID parameter that is sent in. Because remember, I modified my CSHTML, that page directive, so that it now expects an ID parameter of type int. So let's run this. And when this first comes up, I would expect it to not pull up that same default page that it pulled up before. And again, that is because I haven't supplied an ID parameter. So we should get an error, and that's expected. Now let's say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you'll notice all I've done is I've added /1234 to that URL. And that's actually perfectly acceptable because that is an integer. So now it should pull up the page. If I then were to modify that parameter to something else, like this does not work, dummy, enter, that's obviously not an integer, which is why we're getting that same error page. So what I'm trying to show you here is, again, Razor Pages takes very much the same approach as MVC. It just simplifies things. It dumbs it down, assuming that when you're first starting off with your application, you don't need all of that complexity that MVC would give you out of the box. It also solves, it addresses the common complaint developers have in MVC, where they have an MVC controller or a web API controller with maybe an action method that does nothing more than, say, return view or return some sort of action result. It's just a one-liner action method. If you have a lot of action methods that meet that description, maybe give Razor Pages a look, because it could be that you just have more complexity in your application than you really need. Again, Razor Pages is allowing you to start off with something much simpler. And I like to think of it as a build-up approach instead of a tear-down approach that MVC would give you. Another thing that Razor Pages would allow you to easily do without a whole lot of coding is organize by feature. I know Jimmy Bogart did a great talk on this earlier in the conference. If that was something that interested you, maybe take a look at Razor Pages. What I mean by that is, I could easily create a new folder under Pages, call it customer or user or something like that, and then let's just do that real quick. Add new folder. customer, or whatever the feature is in your application. There's scaffolding built into Visual Studio, so I can right-click, go to Add, and I can add a razor page easily from here, just as you can do with MVC. Let's say we want to do that. It's going to ask me for the name of the razor page. I'll just I'll stick with something like edit, because maybe this is my edit customer razor view. And then just by doing what I've done here, routing is already configured to allow this page to pull up. So in other words, if I were to run the application and off the localhost root URL, if I said /customer/edit, it would pull up this razor view that it's attempting to scaffold right now. All right. While that's going on, one other thing that is new in terms of project templates in this 2.0 release is Microsoft has created single-page app templates for the popular libraries and frameworks that are out there. Specifically, the two templates you're going to get in Visual Studio are supporting Angular and React. And there's actually a third one if you're using React.js with Redux as a Flux implementation. So let me show you where those are. And then I'll show you an alternate way to get to those. We'll choose that. So here's one template, and again, I'm not going to talk about this one because Ed covered that earlier today. And then there's React.js and React and Redux. The beauty of these templates is they're going to already configure and scaffold everything that is needed to run those applications. So for me personally, before a tooling like this came along, I had to endure the pain of manually configuring Webpack in my application. That is enough to drive a man to drink right there. Configures Webpack, configures things like hot module reloading in the Angular template, server-side rendering. These are features that it'll give you. It'll configure those just out of the box. It's not something you have to worry about. If you were to take on the challenge of configuring that stuff yourself, I'm speaking from experience. That's a task that has taken me a couple of weeks, I would say, just to get it working the way that I would want it to for an enterprise-grade application. So if that's something that you're doing in your organization using ASP.NET Core with a single-page app framework, check out the templates. That is at least a good starting place. But let's say maybe you're not using Visual Studio 2017, the latest and greatest. Well, we've still got you covered. Let me open a command line here. So earlier in the talk, we were discussing something called the .NET Core CLI. And that came up specifically when we were running the .NET Store and the .NET Publish commands inside of VS Code. So if you're not aware, you can actually invoke the .NET Core CLI with this .NET command. And the .NET Core CLI is actually installed when you install the .NET Core SDK. Let me say .NET New, for example. And what's going to come up is a list of templates that the CLI is capable of scaffolding for me. And you're going to notice that same list there that you would have seen in the project dialog in Visual Studio. And specifically, here they are, ASP.NET Core with Angular, with React.js, React.js and Redux. Here is that Razor Pages template that we looked at, and here's the MVC template. It is actually very possible and quite easy to create your own custom project templates that can bolt right into this .NET Core CLI. And that's something that I know the Progress guys are looking at doing with Kendo UI. If that's something that interests you, I know Ed out at the booth has experience with that. There are also extensive articles online about how to do that. But let's say in your organization you always create an ASP.NET Core app the same way. There are specific patterns and naming conventions that you want your development teams to start with. Well, one way to support that is to create your own custom ASP.NET Core template or .NET Core template. And that, again, could be a template that appears in here when you invoke .NET New, and then you would just pass it the name of that custom template that you've created. One other thing I'll point out while I'm here on the CLI is you'll notice up here under the language column, we see VB. In the 1.x releases, VB.NET was not supported. And specifically, this VB support is for .NET Core 2.0, not ASP.NET Core 2.0. So what I'm saying is, at this time, if you really wanted, you could, for example, create a .NET Core 2.0 class library using VB.NET instead of C#. With ASP.NET Core itself, you're still restricted to C# with the 2.0 release. That's something, or that's a restriction that will eventually be lifted. VB will eventually be supported in ASP.NET Core. It's just not there yet in this 2.0 release. All right. Let's jump back into the slides. Just a couple more to go here. All right. So let's say you have a 1.x ASP.NET Core application and you want to migrate to 2.0 to take advantage of some of these features that we've talked about. We've actually got some pretty extensive documentation out on docs.microsoft.com. There's migration guides. So as a starting point, you should take a look at this particular document. If it's terrible, you can blame the author, myself. My point there is you'll notice on the side of this screenshot there's a comments link. If at any point you read through this document and something just does not make sense, leave a comment. We look at those comments daily and we take them very seriously. This particular document, I call it the starting point. This will show you the bare minimum that is needed in terms of steps to upgrade from 1.x to 2.0. It's also going to walk you through the subtle differences. Let's say if you're targeting .NET Framework instead of .NET Core. It covers both paths in this starting point document. Another area of significant change, and probably the most significant area of change, was authentication and identity. And that was out of scope for this particular talk because, quite frankly, that could be an hour-long talk by itself, just talking about those changes. But if you are using the identity framework or doing anything with social authentication, maybe Twitter or Facebook or Google, any of that stuff, all of the migration steps to migrate your authentication are covered in this particular document. Again, we take feedback very seriously, and for this particular authentication document, we recognize that because the identity framework was essentially rewritten for the 2.0 release, we may not cover all of the cases that you'll encounter in this particular document. And so if you scroll down to the very bottom of this document, you're going to find a link to a GitHub issue out in the ASP.NET organization. And that will take you directly to an issue where customers like yourselves are asking specific questions to the engineering team about, okay, but you didn't cover this edge case in the document. How do I tackle this in migrating to 2.0? And again, the engineering teams are watching this very closely. And so what we're doing as we're discovering these edge cases that we never thought of is we're incorporating that feedback into this particular document. All right. I have also recently did a podcast about a month or so ago that covers everything we've talked about today in pretty extensive detail. There's a link there if you prefer to listen to that instead of read through migration docs. As I mentioned in my last presentation, anything docs related for Microsoft Tech can be found out at docs.microsoft.com. And again, the goal is to eventually migrate all of that documentation off of the legacy MSDN platform and move it here. And much of our product documentation is already out there. The vanity URL, specifically for ASP.NET Core, is docs.asp.net. So if you know you're only interested in ASP.NET Core documentation, and you don't want to start at that landing page and click your way through, bookmark that vanity URL. It's a great place to start. I've also got my Twitter handle up here. If there's something you think of maybe a week from now that wasn't addressed in the presentation, or you just can't think of the question now, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, or again, leave a comment on one of those migration guides. I've got the QR code for the slide deck that we used today, and above that is the bit.ly URL that would take you there as well. And the final thing I'd mention is this conference takes feedback very seriously, and I've got a bit.ly URL here for a speaker evaluation. I encourage you to fill that out and just give the organizers some feedback on this particular session. Things that could be improved, things you liked, that's all stuff they want to hear. So that's all I had. I appreciate everyone for attending my session, especially the last one of the day. Don't forget about, again, the session next door, the prize giveaway. You need to be present to win. And with that, I'll take questions if there are any. Otherwise, I'll be up here afterwards. I'll hang around for a bit. Thank you.